Hello and welcome to another episode of AUCTV. My name is Jamil Nanji, and on today's episode, we'll be discussing an important issue that has been raised. With the recent media coverage in Egypt, a vast number of allegations has been sent against an individual who was a former student at AUC, and this has brought forward an important issue of sexual harassment. To discuss this on today's episode, we have with us Dr. Hani Henry, the Associate Professor of Psychology. Dr. Hani, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, before we get into the core issues of this topic, I want to know from you, what is harassment and in what forms can we see harassment?
Well, if you look at the definition of harassment, a simple definition, it's any act that violates the right, sexual act that is, that violates the right of an individual. So if you violate their boundaries, if you talk, if you touch them, if you talk to them in a very derogative way, if you make any sexual suggestions about the way they move. So any act that is more like a violation of this person that comes from a sexual direction, that's sexual harassment.
You once mentioned that in a survey conducted by the UN Entity for Gender Equality and Empowerment for Women, it showed that 99% of Egyptian women surveyed that they have experienced some sort of sexual harassment. What, in your view, are the reasons behind the phenomenon of sexual harassment in Egypt? Is it women, is it men, or is it just the society as a whole?
Well, if you want to understand why sexual harassment is rampant and widespread in Egypt, then you need to think about it as a systemic problem, not just an individual problem. It's if you look at it as more like an individual act where people cannot control themselves sexually and they're acting on their sexuality, that makes you miss the big picture. And I conducted a study and actually interviewed sexual harassers in the Egyptian streets. And it was very clear that the feminist theory, which described sexual harassment as a sexist act, not a sexual act alone, can help us understand this phenomenon and why it's widespread in Egypt. And so there's more of a normalization and tolerance of this act by many segments of the population. So I think this is sexist because you're not taking a firm stance to protect women and to make the streets safe for them. It sends a message that society is not treating women with fairness, is not allowing them to compete with men. So you have to think about this more systemically. And does it reflect institutional sexism or just people cannot control themselves sexually? The normalization of this act, the blaming of women, the fact that laws are not reinforced. I think you need to think about it at a larger scheme. It's not just an individual act.
Now there's a conception that sexual harassment is a woman's problem. Do you agree? Kindly share.
Well, that's exactly what we're saying. When you look at this and like you blame the victim, right? So woman's problem, people say it's because of the way they walk or the way they talk or the way they're dressed. But then you see everybody, it doesn't matter whether they're fully covered or whether not, everybody's exposed to harassment. And so when you say it's women's problem, you're perpetuating sexism, what I just said earlier. I also have to say something like most people believe in what we call in psychology, the just world hypothesis, which means like if you're good things will happen to you. And if you're bad or evil, bad things will happen to you. And sometimes this theory, when perpetuated, it actually can further the status of blaming the victim. So they have to find a reason to understand this heinous act, and they have to blame someone for it. And so I think this is a problem with many people, is that they have this just word hypothesis and that make them end up blaming women for their victimization. But again, look at it from the sexism point of view. It's like you're blaming the victim. You're not allowing women to live and flourish to work and to go to the street to seek their job. You're competing their efforts, you're punishing their competitive efforts. So um, yeah, so it's both the just word hypothesis plus institutional sexism will end up blaming the victim, and that's what happens with racism, right? So people would just blame uh, victims of police brutality, that they did something to provoke the police, they did something they are not good characters, and they must have brought it onto themselves. So if you see racism this way, you have to also see sexism this way.
From a psychological perspective, from your field, in your view, how can harassment be prevented?
Well, I'm very, yeah, I'm very excited to hear that there are prevention programs going on, and that part of orientation in many organizations has to do with sexual harassment prevention, and this is part of orientation. I think AUC does that too, and they actually offered workshops for people to to know what harassment is and how to prevent it. My only concern about these prevention programs, and if we're talking like psychological science, is like if you keep telling people, don't do this, don't do that, don't look, don't see, don't, people will actually have the tendency to do the opposite. So when you tell people to do things, they're tempted to try. And so one thing I would say with these programs, and psychology would tell us, is to acknowledge that anybody has a natural attraction towards certain people, you know, and so we're not supposed to disown that feeling of feeling attracted to people. The only problem is when we act on it, right? And so what happens is that in these programs, you want to tell men that, or whoever is, you know, preventing harassment from, is to acknowledge that they can be naturally attracted, but they should remind themselves they shouldn't act on it. And I know this sounds like a broken record now, but why do men act more on their harassment than women? Again, it's because of institutional sexism. It's like you're targeting underprivileged population, such as women's population. Women are targeted because of their less powerful position in society. And that's why sexism is repeatedly mentioned. It's really something you cannot divorce from the big problem. So psychology would give you prevention programs, but we really need to tell men or whoever is attracted, it's normal to be attracted, but don't act.
All right, doctor. On that note, I'd like to know from you, what measures should schools, universities take to eliminate sexual harassment and attain a safe and healthy campus?
Well, for a starter, I really like AUC policy of zero tolerance, but the problem is we need to reinforce this. So zero tolerance. Okay, so what are the consequences? We have consequences when people report sexual harassment. Is this issue closed, or is there serious investigation? If the community or victim of sexual harassment need to be assured that there is a procedure in place, that there are people who are really having zero tolerance. But I think, one of the things we need to do in help to make a healthy, to make our campuses healthy, is to start the prevention programs that I said, that I spoke about before. These programs would aim to educate men about the negative psychological consequences of sexual harassment. We have research out there that says that sexual harassment can have a negative impact on the victim. Sexual harassment can lead to many psychological disorders such as anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorders. So one of the things is to teach empathy and should also teach men about institutional sexism. And so they look at the problem from different levels, not just from the individual level, but from the systemic level. Okay, what is the school and university position on women's right and equality? Is this a school or a university that really has done a good job bridging the gap, whether we're talking about salary gap or position gap between men and women? Is this an institute that is is working on tackling sexism. So again, we cannot just educate people and teach them empathy and help them understand the impact of sexual harassment, psychological impact of sexual harassment on its victims. But we need to think about the school and the university and whether it has tackled institutional sexism or not.
What is your advice to any individual exposed to harassment? How should they react? What action should they take? And do you encourage them to seek counseling?
Well, most victims of sexual harassment may vary in their response. Some may learn, unfortunately, to cope with it and silence their voice, but others may actually be traumatized. For the latter group, sexual harassment can be very traumatizing, especially if it's repeated and uncontrolled. Definitely, they should seek therapy. We have a wonderful wellness center in our university, as well as the psychology clinic. We have a clinic, psychological center clinic. They can, what therapy can do is just to help the person feel validated and help them verbalize their painful experience, and also teach them how to cope with these experiences and receive the psychological support they deserve. The problem is some victims may blame themselves for being harassed because they keep hearing that message from society. And this is what we call in psychology internalization. It's like when I keep telling you, you're bad, you're bad, you're bad, you did something wrong, you did something wrong, you start to believe it. And so I think we need to tackle this in a positive, in an assertive way, and help empower these victims and help them also regain their self-confidence. It's a very long journey. So if they don't seek therapy, at least we need to help them stop internalizing the negative message of blame that they keep getting from people, and that they stop. Sometimes people end up hating themselves. Sometimes you also have to educate them, because many victims of sexual harassment and sexual abuse actually report feeling frozen. So when they get the harassment, they don't know what to do. It's almost like a deer hitting a strong light. And so therapy can help people understand their feelings, can help them learn skills, can help them become more assertive in facing the perpetrators. So it's we cannot just generalize and say everybody needs counseling, but counseling can actually help many people.
Indeed, it must be a really tough journey for somebody who's been through such sort of harassment. But I, as an individual from AUC, have friends who've also witnessed and gone through such circumstances in their life. How should I best support someone who says he or she has experienced sexual harassment? Or what help can I get to support them?
Well, I think the if you're not a therapist and you're wanting to help people, first, one thing you can do is to try to identify the resources that these people may use. For example, I know that the National Council of Women in Egypt has now offered victims of sexual harassment and assault legal services, free legal services, and they push them to press charges against the individual who was accused of many crimes. So I think what we do is we need to give social support to these folks. We need to validate them. We need to encourage them to speak out. But we also need to be there for them. Whatever they want us to be there for, we do it. I mean, because sometimes we may push them so hard and then we're reenacting the cycle of abuse by telling them what's good for them. So I think you just be there, you provide the containment, the support, but at the same time, you don't patronize them. You don't tell them, you should do this, you should do that, because that's where make them feel like as if we're repeating the cycle of abuse indirectly by telling them what to do.
Looking at our own institution of AUC, there are ongoing campus conversations to encourage students to speak up. Now, AUC's experience on harassment, telling the students to speak up, report any incident that they came through or witnessed through AUC's official reporting channels. Now, how do you see this as a step in tackling the issue? How can we as a community support the direction and encourage members of the community to speak up?
That's a great question. I think it's wonderful that the university has started this initiative. I would only say that we have to be very culturally sensitive in the way we deal with that. We need to acknowledge certain traditions that may inhibit women from speaking out. One of the most important thing, and actually the government has just passed a law, is to maintain the confidentiality of these victims. It's very important to do that. I remember when incidents of sexual harassment and sexual assault started in the US, and there were lawsuits about this. They used to like not put the names, and they put blank face and all of that stuff. But now people learn that it's okay to disclose your identity, but we still have to be very culturally sensitive in the way we go about this. So that's something that we need to consider, is because of certain cultural traditions, people may not be able to open up easily. Issues of honor, issues of bringing attention. We can look at this as another manifestation of victimizing women, that they're not able to speak out. But we also, the AUC also needs to make sure that the university trusts that these investigations will be serious and there will be repercussions. And it's not just something that we do in response to the major incident that we are all talking about these days. And one thing I would also say, that this effort should be continuous. We have in Egyptian and Arabic saying "afat haratna in nisyan," which means like we tend to forget easily. So this effort should be continuous, not just the response to the current media hype related to that case. And I think the zero tolerance is something that, and I'm not saying that we have to see people who are punished for this, but maybe there may be people that will be punished, and there has to be announcements about this. So, but not, of course, to falsely accuse people. Make sure that this process has its own integrity, and that people are not falsely accused. I think it's very tricky to do all of this. But again, we need to be culturally sensitive.
Doctor, I think this has been a conversation that has been very pivotal in terms of how students and the AUC community will look at such sensitive situations that we could face possibly on campus or outside of campus. Finally, in terms of all the situations and issues that are ongoing in the year 2020, from racism to police brutality to sexual harassment, these are all situations where more and more education and training would help us to know the situation better. What kind of education and training would you recommend for the members of our community at AUC should we get to raise our awareness in harassment and the actions that we should take?
Well, psychologists have always been praised for providing something called psychoeducation. So we use psychological science to educate people about the certain problems that face society and face individuals. And so I think we could start a psychoeducation program where, number one, we should educate people about sexism, and that sexual harassment might be a form of sexism. I'm not saying that all sexual harassment is because of sexism, but we need to look at this picture. We also need to educate people about the harmful psychological effect of sexual harassment and the disorders it can cause, such as anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorders. Another thing I really like to stress in a program like that would be teaching empathy. And I'm not saying sympathy. Empathy is a different approach, is where you actually put yourself in the other person's shoes. And there was a very interesting video of a gentleman who, it went viral in Facebook, I think, where he got dressed up like a woman, he put makeup, and he actually wore very, very tall, long clothes. But he was harassed like crazy, right? And so they asked him, how did you feel? And then you can see his empathy, right? Like he put himself literally in women's shoes and felt like, okay, all the humiliation they experienced, the attacks. He was touched actually by some men. He was stalked by some men. So I think we need to teach empathy, and not necessarily that we make people get dressed up as women and see what happens, but really try to get outside your perspective and see it from women's perspective. And as I said earlier, we're not telling people to let go of their attraction. Attraction is natural and it's healthy, but don't act on it. And acting on it perpetuates sexism because you're targeting a soft target. You're targeting underprivileged, a person who is not in a strong position in society, especially in our patriarchal society. I actually spoke to one of my students who wanted to start some sort of a movement about this. He's actually taking a psychology of dream course with me this summer. And I suggested to him, why don't you create a group, a group only of men, and we call it Men Against Sexual Harassment. And so men would educate men about all of the stuff that we've been covering in our interview. And research has shown that peer influence is more powerful than any other form of influence. Peers can influence each other more than their parents, more than their professors, more than their religious leaders. And I think this can positively influence their fear, and it can have wonderful results. So maybe this is something we should suggest to the university clubs. If we have men, our young men who were very tolerant, who are respected young men, and wanting to educate their fellow men about the problem of sexual harassment and how it's perpetuated, that might be actually a good place to start.
Doctor, this has been really eye-opening in terms of all the overwhelming talking points that we've discussed on this very sensitive issue. And I wish you the best of luck. And I pose to all the students, stand up for your peers, speak up for those who have been violated, as well as continue to support one another throughout this time. Thank you once again, Dr. Hani, the Associate Professor for Psychology. Well, that's it for AUCTV. Stay tuned.